Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Pratik and I will be taking up the news today discussion for 2nd June. So let us take a look into the main news that we are going to cover. First news is about a PRS annual report on the shortcomings of the Indian state legislature. So it talks about all the details about the number of sittings and the ordinances passed and all the important ways in which they are functioning. The second news is about the future of IMEC amid the West Asian war. So in this particular topic, we will be covering the significance, some details about IMEC and the challenges that it is facing and what can be done to address those challenges. Third news is about India's seafood export, which have reached record high in the FY 2025-2026. And the fourth news is about MAHA Maha Water Mission that is launched towards water secure future. In the fifth news, we'll be covering emerging power of synthetic biology. In the places in news, we'll be covering Australia, and we also have a couple of quick updates as well. So let us start with the very first news, that is about the PRS annual report that has talked about the functioning of several state legislatures in India. And this topic is very important from the perspective of GS paper 2 polity, because we need to understand the functioning of parliament or legislature in general. Okay, so here the key takeaways, before I talk about the key highlights of the report, you should understand what exactly is the function of a legislature. Okay, so in general there are three major functions that a legislature is supposed to perform. The first is about asking questions, especially pertaining to passing of bill. The second important function that a legislature is supposed to perform is to hold financial accountability. And third major news or third major function that a legislature is supposed to perform is to ensure overall executive accountability. Now, India has parliamentary form of democracy both at the center and at the state. Okay, so it means that the executive is essentially has to be accountable to the parliament, and there are certain means through which the executive is held accountable, right? So we all know about the parliamentary sessions, the number of sittings, the times under which the bill is referred to a committee. But when it comes to the state legislature, many of the times the data is not very much clear. Now this report becomes very important, very significant, because it talks about the performance of the state legislature, right? So it helps us understand how they are functioning and to what extent they are able to perform their constitutional duty. So if we take a look into the key findings of the report, so we will be talking about 5 major key findings, and this is going to help you understand to what extent they are able to perform their constitutional duties and obligation. So first thing is, in terms of legislative settings, to what extent they are meeting, right? So here, what is the constitutional obligation? So constitution per se has not mentioned the duration for which houses are supposed to meet, or parliament or state legislature are supposed to meet. But there is one important consideration, that it mentioned that not more than 6 months should pass before the last sitting. So it means that at least they should meet once in 6 months. So this basically tells that the state legislative assembly have met for an average of only 24 days in 2025. So in a year which spans from 365 days, the total meeting that has been held is 24 days in an average. Now this data is particularly for 27 states plus 3 UTs with assemblies. So here we have 28 states, but since Manipur is under President's rule, therefore this data does not include Manipur. Also, under union territories with legislature, we have Delhi, we have Puducherry, and state of or UT of Jammu and Kashmir, right? So this is the first observation, that in terms of the number of sitting, it is only 24 on an average. The second important detail is that despite this limited amount of time, the number of bills, if you look at this, it is around over 600 bills have been passed. So this essentially means that on an average, 20 bills have been being passed by each legislative unit, right? And then, more importantly, less than 5% of the bills are referred to the committees, right? So not just the procedural mechanism or the number of days are less, but at the same time, the quality of debate are also being diluted. So what exactly is going to be the implication for this? So if the parliament of the state or the state legislature are not meeting regularly, if they are not debating regularly, what exactly does it lead to? So first, it leads to rushing of the laws. So there are not significant debate on the various pros and cons of the laws, and it gets passed through without any expert scrutiny. So as in the parliamentary democracy, we all know that it is the mandate of the executive to draft the bill, and ultimately once it is passed through the legislature, it becomes an act, okay? But without any scrutiny by either the people's representative or through the account parliamentary committees or the state legislature committees, they do not withstand the scrutiny of the committees. Then the rare use of legislative committees denies the stakeholder input. Stakeholders are those people or those group of people which are impacted from the policy decisions. Now, if they are not included in terms of the decision making, then definitely it leads to a significant vacuum in terms of consultation. For example, if the government is passing a law on education, on agriculture, or local bodies, anything which is there is as part of the state list, then if you do not consult the experts or the stakeholders which are going to be impacted, then it somehow creates some kind of resentment, right? It leads to some sort of problem. The second part is about debate on budgets. The second aspect or the second important function of a legislature is to ensure financial accountability. And this is particularly done through debate on budgets. But if you look at this number, on an average, assemblies have spent just 8 days debating their state assemblies, state budgets. States like Assam, Himachal Pradesh, and Jharkhand have passed more than 70% of budgets without any discussion, with zero discussion. Now, what exactly this leads to? This leads to erosion of the financial accountability. It undermines the legislature's constitutional duty to oversee that the spending pattern which is happening or which is being done by the executive is following certain norms or not. The third important observation or the finding of the PRS report is that the states have been issuing a lot of ordinances. In fact, there is a 27% increase in the ordinances from 100 that was issued in 2024 to 127. So in a way, it is 27% jump. And what exactly is the impact of this? It leads to what is called as executive overreach. You may have heard about terms like judicial overreach or judicial activism, but this is a term that essentially means that executive is gaining more power compared to the legislature. So in a way, this term essentially represents that state executive are bypassing the assembly. They are not allowing the assembly to perform, right? And they're enacting laws by decree or avoiding immediate democratic debate. The fourth important observation is that 8 state assemblies are functioning without a deputy speaker, where in Jharkhand particularly, no deputy speaker has been appointed since last 21 years, right? So this in a way signifies a huge institutional decay, because this emanates, this provision of appointment of deputy speaker, it emerges from the constitutional provision under Article 178 of the Constitution, right? So in a way, it provides or leads to breach of the established parliamentary procedures. And lastly, governor's assent. Friction over governors delaying assent to bills have forced bills, states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and even West Bengal to approach the Supreme Court. And under that, Supreme Court had also provided a judgment that gave time limit for the governor to decide on the bill. But at the same time, then the matter was referred back to the Supreme Court under the advisory power under Article 143, under which again there has been some sort of via media received here. In a way, this has led to systemic delays in governor's assent signal, and it has led to a breakdown between elected state governments and the appointed constitutional functionary, which basically means that because of the delays by the governor, in a way that this has led to a huge constitutional friction. So this is the present state of the legislature, which is in a way functioning with these problems, or this is the state of function that they are leading, and these are the implications that emerge out of it. Now, what could be the solution out of this? The solution could be that perhaps we need to impose or increase the number of sittings. In fact, Law Commission of India have given certain suggestions regarding this. In fact, we can also reduce the number of usage of ordinances, and constitutional vacancies also needs to be plugged. So these measures can be suggested to improve on these measures. From this topic, UPSC had asked a question: to what extent, in your view, the parliament is able to ensure accountability of the executive in India? So if we replace parliament by legislature, whatever we have discussed, we can write it here along with data, right? So because this, not only this article or this topic that we had covered, it talks about data, it also talks about the implication. So we can talk about, yet in certain areas, parliament is able to ensure, or the legislature is able to ensure accountability, right? But that largely is the arena of theory. But in practice, we see that so much breaches happen. So you can talk about that, and then you can talk about some of the measures that can be taken to ensure that the parliament is able to influence, to exert more pressure or more accountability on the executive. The second news is about the future of IMEC, that is India Middle East European Economic Corridor, amid or in the middle of the West Asian crisis, right? So this topic or this article is taken from an editorial in the Hindu, and the author has analyzed the reason why IMEC came into first place and the challenges it is presently facing and what could be the way around for this. So the problem that the IMEC is facing is because of the, not just of the Iran war, but also because of other challenges. But let's understand the whole idea behind IMEC. So what is IMEC? IMEC is a multimodal connectivity project. Multimodal basically means that it will have multiple modes, not just one mode. Just that is, it will have sea mode of connectivity, it will have railways, it will have roadways. And what is the purpose? It is to connect India to Europe through West Asia, right? India to Europe through West Asia. But you must be asking that India already has connectivity to Europe through this Suez Canal, right? And also through, India has proposed other means such as the Indian North-South Transport Corridor. Then what exactly is the requirement here? So here the need of IMEC comes from the fact that there are certain choke points that India needs to avoid. Now you would be asking, what are choke points? Choke points are those areas which are very narrow in nature, which can be controlled by a single country and can be blocked during the time of crisis. And the most significant example of this is Strait of Hormuz, which have been blocked by Iran during this war. Also, you have Suez Canal, which continues to be very traffic prone, and then there is the Red Sea, which have often been blocked by Yemen, by the Houthis that are staying, or that are part of staying in Yemen, right? So in a way, what we can see here is that because of these choke points, it is very essential that India has an alternative route to reach to Europe. Recently, we have also signed the mother of all trade deal with European Union. We also have signed TEPA with the European Free Trade Association. So it is very desirable that India has certain kind of connectivity which is not influenced by these considerations, by geostrategic consideration. So this is a very important step in bringing India and Europe closer. Now, what exactly are the two components of the IMEC? There are two major components. One is the East Corridor. The East Corridor is the sea route which connects Mumbai to UAE, right? UAE essentially the Jebel Ali port, all these ports in UAE, it connects. Then from UAE to, it goes to Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi Arabia it goes to Jordan, and from Jordan it goes to Haifa port of Israel. So here this part is sea route, then this is proposed to be a land route, and from here Haifa to Piraeus, that is in Greece, it is essentially again a maritime route. So this is the eastern route and this is the northern route, right? So it has essentially two components, okay? The east corridor and the north corridor. Then who are the signatories? Largely the G7 countries, and it was formally announced when India hosted the G20 summit in 2023. But just after that, the October 7 attack happened, and because of that, the project went into cold bag, right? So which are the signatories of this? India, US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Union. And what is the significance of India apart from the fact that it blocks or it gives an alternate route? It reduces transportation time by 40%, or it is estimated to reduce it by 40%, and logistics cost by 30%, because it will avoid this whole route, that is the longer route from Suez, and providing an alternative to congested routes such as Suez Canal. So these are the importance of this. In fact, not just IMEC, India has also started with INSTC project, and in fact, China is also has started with BRI project, Belt and Road Initiative, largely to ensure that its Balakad state, whenever it is also a sort of choke point for China. So it has components like the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor that provides China access to the Arabian Sea through Pakistan. So what I'm trying to say here is that IMEC is a proposed route that will provide access to India to Europe, right? So again, it is a very important development, but the problem is because of certain vulnerabilities, it has stuck. So first thing is that the escalation of the Iran-Israel war, they have intensified into a broader regional war threatening the IMEC's proposed transportation corridor. The first threat with respect to this proposed corridor was the October 7 attack by Hamas, right? So that led to Israel launching a war against the Hamas. And secondly, then the war also involved Iran. And then because of the Iran, Israel and US war, that has again spiraled into not just these countries, but it has become a regional war. And you must have also understood or seen that UAE's ports have also been attacked. Secondly, it has led to trade route disruption. Strategic choke points such as Strait of Hormuz have triggered spikes in oil prices. In fact, more than 90% of India's crude oil is imported from West Asia, and we have already seen the sharp increase in essential commodity prices, in the petrol prices, in diesel prices, etc. And this has undermining the IMEC's economic feasibility. Then the second important development is that the regional cooperation framework is also breaking down because there is some sort of diplomatic issues between UAE and Saudi Arabia. In fact, UAE recently has also pulled out from OPEC as well, right? Then these are these problems. Plus there is problems between Israel and Arab nations, which has stalled the coordinated infrastructure developments. Now, in light of this, what can be the proposed solution? The author has provided certain suggestions. First is that we must promote regional dialogue and cooperation to ensure the stability required for smooth project execution. So this is essentially will be the diplomatic initiative which will ensure that Israel and West Asian countries can have some sort of working relation. The second important thing is that we may use some phase development. For example, prioritize key infrastructure segments. For example, here, instead of taking this route from UAE, perhaps we can take it from, the route can divert from Oman. Okay, so this is what the author has suggested because Oman is relatively immune from the regional war, even though it has been minor hit, but still it would provide an alternative route. So this kind of approach where we develop some phase development, that could also work. Third is, we should deepen partnership. We should enhance economic and trade ties with key partners like the European Union and the Gulf nation, which we already are doing. We have recently signed FTA with or CEPA with Oman, and it has come into effect from today. So this India is already doing. right? So these are the measures that we can take, right? So let's talk about the third news, which is about India's seafood export. And very interestingly, this has jumped to the record high in the present financial year, right? And the importance of this development is that the seafood export has a very important multiplier effect when it comes to employment, when it comes to food and nutritional security, and with respect to export earnings and sustainable livelihood. So let's understand and go what exactly is the whole findings or details about this news. So in terms of the highlights of this particular news, in terms of both volume and value, the seafood export has increased a very important number. India has exported around 19,72,000 metric tons of seafood, and the value here is around $8.46 billion dollars. In terms of the composition of the seafood export, shrimp is at number one. In fact, it amounts to 65% of contribution in terms of value and 40% in terms of volume. When it comes to the destination, the US is the most important destination which consumes most of the seafood export, followed by China. Then you have European Union, then Japan, and then the Southeast Asian countries. In terms of the other export product, apart from shrimp, we have the second frozen fish and dried seafood, which are the in terms of the number of export items. Now, what exactly are some of the challenges that we need to understand? Because again, even though it has done reasonably well, $8.46 billion is not a small number, but still there are certain challenges that we need to overcome. First is that there are non-tariff measures, and these non-tariff measures are essentially non-quantitative in nature, which means that the countries have the developed countries have certain expectations of the quality of the food products or the export products. And when Indian or any country's export products are not of that quality, then they impose what is called as non-tariff barriers. In fact, recently you may have heard the news that Japan has sent some of the Indian mangoes back to India because of concerns in the quality. So this is what exactly US also did in 2023, where it rejected 3 products from India due to maximum residue level. So maximum residual level is an indication of the acceptable level of the pesticides or the various kind of preservatives. The second part is about trade duties, and this is a protectionist measure where countries use anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties to protect the domestic industries from the unfair competition. Third important challenge is the exporters. So these are the external challenges that they face, and then there are internal challenges. One is that there is problem with respect to raw material due to seasonality and inconsistent quality, and then there is problem of infrastructure. For example, to export raw materials like this, we require huge infrastructure, cold storage chains, and the stringent temperature control, etc., because even a minor change can compromise the quality, taste, etc. So this infrastructure again requires a lot of boost here. Now let's talk about what India has already done in this regard. So first thing is that we have an authority called Marine Products Export Development Authority, just like we have APEDA, the Agricultural Product Export Development Authority. Now this is a dedicated agency to facilitate seafood export and it works under Ministry of Commerce and Industry. It was set up in 1972. Its headquarters is in Kochi, that is in Kerala. And the idea is that it works as the nodal agency to ensure where to go for markets, where to put up the various storage facility, etc. The second important measure is the flagship scheme, that is Pradhan Mantri Matsya Sampada Yojana. Essentially, it has subsumed all the fisheries related measures into one, so that it provides for harmonization of all the important details. Second is about fisheries and aquaculture infrastructure development fund. So this talks about development of cold storage infrastructure, irradiation centers, etc., to improve the quality of the products. Then We also have other measures such as enhanced duty-free import limit of specified inputs used in seafood processing. Then we have another version of certification, that is Shah Fari certification. This basically is a Sanskrit word which talks about quality certification. Now, what are the key policy recommendations? So these are the measures which we have already taken. What are the way forward? So way forward is, first we require a central scheme for development of indigenous brood stock. Brood stocks means that we require those species which mate and they produce species, right? So in fact, India relies on the export of brood stock, but it keeps on, it is expensive and it also is pathogen prone. So for this, we need to promote indigenous brood stock. The second thing is that we need a central scheme for meeting global quality. And for this, we require some global seafood quality standards, and we need to improve upon the certification process. And then we need to manage country-specific export bans and mitigating freight cost. So we need to analyze what exactly are the gray areas of the countries and what exactly are they concerned about, and then we need to take measures here. Apart from that, we need to have an umbrella body for the sector, such as Seafood Sector Governing Council for collaboration, infrastructure support and development, because the MPEDA has a lot on its plate, so perhaps another body can help take up some of the load. Right. So let's talk about the fourth news, which is Maha Water Mission launched towards water secure future. And what is Maha? It is Mission for Advancement in High Impact Areas for Water. It is a joint initiative of by Anusandhan National Research Center and Ministry of Jal Shakti, right? So it has couple of objectives, but we should understand that when it comes to water use efficiency, India ranks among the bottommost countries. Moreover, if you look at the groundwater extraction in India, 87% of the groundwater utilization is done through for agriculture purpose. And India's, some of the policies that India follow for agriculture, right, they directly contribute for depletion of groundwater. Apart from that, there is also quality concerns, there is also wastage of water, there is very little usage of water for recycling purpose. And on top of that, because of the environmental concerns and because of the erratic monsoon, we are also witnessing a decline in the volume of water that we are using. So here, in light of this becomes very important. And one more context here, that earlier the research grant was used to be given to elite universities and colleges. But now this program that has been launched by Ministry of Jal Shakti and ANRF, it is essentially to democratize the research. Because now, if you can see the key highlights, it is to select multidisciplinary consortia which involves universities, startups, MSME, industry, etc. for high impact, innovative and scalable water solutions. So in a way, the project or the research grant is not just limited to elite universities, but it has been democratized. Any university or any MSME, industry or startup which has high impact or which can provide for some high innovative solution and scalable solution will get certain grant. And for this, up to 20 crores will be provided. So the overall amount is 200 crore. And for this, at max 20 crore will be provided to a specific stakeholder. Then what are the 5 priority areas? First is about water resource assessment. We need to know what exactly is the amount or the nature of water quality that we have, right? Second would be about drinking water. This is of the second most important area. Third is about water quality and ecological health. So first we'll determine the quantity, then we'll prioritize the water, drinking water, then we'll talk about the quality. And fourth, water use efficiency, so that in a way it will be promoting what is called as circular economy. So we will be utilizing the wastewater and then integrate that into the water flow. And finally, we will take measures for climate resilience and adaptation. Then what are the significant role of the modern technology towards water secure future? So this essentially will tell you that how we are using various technology for water management, right? So First is about blockchain technology for recording water transactions securely, ensuring water management of shared water resources. And this will be particularly useful in light of these interstate river water dispute, or with respect to groundwater utilization, because blockchain technology can help understand what is exactly is the record of water utilization. Then the smart monitoring can be done through Internet of Things, sensors, remote sensing and machine learning. Water treatment technologies such as the graphene filters, solar desalination, and forward osmosis can be very useful for improving the quality of the water. And distributed water system through rainwater harvesting and grey water recycling can empower individuals and communities. Further, we can also promote precision agriculture, because many of the water resources, especially, are wasted during the agricultural process. So if we can utilize irrigation in a very sustained or a very precise manner through use of data, satellite data, through this can help in optimizing irrigation and reduce wastewater or water wastage. So what are the key initiatives that we have undertaken? So first is scientific data driven conservation, and for this it has been done through enumeration, geotagging, incentivization, and Jal Shakti Abhiyan has been taken up. Then real-time ground level monitoring through various telemetry system, usage of satellites, as we were talking about earlier, such as platforms like GRACE and also NISAR. They are here for detection of groundwater changes at macro level. And then we also have smart elements in sustainable urban development. For example, we have Amrut, that is Atal Mission for Urban Renewable and Urban Transformation, that was launched in 2015. And one of the primary pillar of Amrut was to secure water connectivity and to provide for better water utilization, right? So it will also have smart elements like SCADA as part of water supply and sewerage project. So it will ensure that water governance can be strengthened. Fine. So in terms of this PYQ, UPSC had asked a question, that is, examine the factors responsible for depletion of groundwater in India. What are the steps taken by the governments to mitigate such depletion of groundwater? So again, it is possible that UPSC would not specifically ask about groundwater, but they can ask you a question in terms of water in general, right? So we can talk about all these measures that we have taken here. The fifth news is about emerging power of synthetic biology. And this is a very interesting article because it talks about how the advancement in AI and in programming is going to impact synthetic biology, right? And especially with respect to how it is going to create so much changes. So from the perspective of exam, we need to understand the idea behind synthetic biology, what exactly it is, how does it is different from the genetic editing part, etc. So synthetic biology means redesigning organism for useful purposes by engineering them to have new abilities. So we all know that the human or the human species is made of trillions of cells. Within cells, you have various DNAs, right? So DNAs are something that essentially talks about how the entire structure of body will be done, right? So it is from it helps in composition of proteins, and the DNA converts to RNA through a process called transcription, okay? And then from the cell, so DNA, it resides in nucleus, and then it goes, it's like it resides in nucleus. It is the blueprint. So just like a building has a blueprint, you have DNA. And then what is RNA? RNA is a photocopy of a DNA, right? So you can consider this RNA as the photocopy of the DNA, which has certain differences. For example, DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded, and there are differences as well. So RNA then leads to the synthesis of proteins. And then there are several arrangements in which the molecules like ATCG are developed, right? So what exactly is synthetic biology, that earlier we used to read them, but now there is possibility of not just editing. So editing essentially is the whole idea of genome editing, is that you can edit, you can stitch together long stretches of DNA, right, and insert them in an organism's genome, which basically mean that there is possibility of editing a genome sequence. And within that, for example, if there is ATCG, something of that nature is done, you can edit this one and you can insert some other molecule here, and that could lead to some curation of disease, etc. But what if an entire different set of code can be inserted? This is what, and this is how synthetic biology is different or more comprehensive compared to the genome editing. So genome editing only talks about editing things, but synthetic biology essentially is about producing, right? It is tool to make, it essentially provides you things with inserting them in organism genome. So essentially it talks about producing entire thing and then not just about editing, right? So what exactly are the key applications of synthetic biology? Synthetic biology can be used across various domains, not just in terms of health, but in terms of crop generation, in terms of food security, circularity, in terms of waste reduction, in terms of distributed manufacturing. So it has a lot of benefits. For example, in human health, it can help in personalized cell and gene therapies. It can help in deliver therapeutic agents. It can help in regenerative medicine through 3D printing, etc. So these are the benefits in terms of personal health. In terms of food security, it can help in bioengineered microorganism. It can create better outputs, especially with respect to biopesticides, bioherbicides, etc. It can provide real-time monitoring of targeted environment compounds. It can help in emission reduction. It can help in reduction of plastic pollution, because it can create organism which can eat polymer, plastic, etc. Right? And then it can also lead to distributed bioprocesses. And because of the distributed bioprocesses, it is possible that the emission that leads to the whole transport or the logistics, that can also be reduced. Right? So these are the key applications. What are the challenges? See, first thing is that it is going to take a lot of resources, financial resources, human resources, to synthesize this properly and to make it really affordable. So it is going to be very expensive. Secondly, it also has potential for hazard, essentially because it can release genetically engineered microorganism into environment. Now this is very significant because these genetically engineered microorganism can also multiply on its own, right? This is something which is not felt in, for example, in nuclear waste. Nuclear waste will not multiply on their own, but the engineered microorganisms can multiply on their own. So in a way that can lead to ripple effect. Thirdly, it also lead to a biosecurity risk, where if it comes into some unintended or some terrorist hand, it can lead to development of bioweapons. Then it can also create cyber biosecurity threats, because we are seeing a growing interaction between biology and security. For example, retina scan, etc., which are very essential for the cyber security part. But again, they can be mimicked and it can have an impact on the cyber security as well. Also, apart from these challenges, we also have ethical challenges, because it leads to problems in equity, distribution of risk, benefits, access, etc. So these are some of the potential challenges that we definitely should keep in mind before progress in synthetic biology should be conducted. Let's talk about the place in news now. And today we have Australia. So this was in news because India's defense minister and Australian deputy prime minister and defense minister have co-chaired the second Indo-Australian defense ministers dialogue. So in a way, what we can think of Australia is that it has become an important defense partner, especially given the fact that Indo-Pacific strategy, both of them are on the same level, right? So let's talk about the political features of Australia. So it is the smallest continent and the sixth largest country on the earth. It lies between the Pacific east on the eastern side and the Indian Ocean west in the southern hemisphere. What are the geographical features? So interestingly, around 1/3 of Australia is desert. And what are the important deserts of Australia? Great Victoria, Great Sandy, Tanami Desert, Simpson Desert, and Gibson Desert. Major mountains that Australia has: Great Dividing Ridge, McDonnell Ranges. It has major rivers as Murray Darling and Lachlan. And then it also has Great Barrier Reef in the northern eastern part, is the world's largest coral reef. So this is all about Australia. Make sure that you understand some of the maritime neighbors that it has. Now let's talk about some quick updates. The first news is about isobutanol. And the reason why this is in news, because now India is likely to use isobutanol for blending with diesel. So in India, we already have allowed ethanol blending up to 20%, and the number could go even higher. But the same experiment of blending ethanol with diesel did not work. Therefore, this experiment is now to be conducted, that isobutanol is going to be blended with diesel. Let's understand what exactly is isobutanol. So isobutanol is a 4-carbon alcohol, that is C4H10O, that is its chemical symbol, making it a higher alcohol compared to ethanol. So ethanol is C2H5OH, which contains only 2 carbon atoms, and isobutanol has 4 carbon atoms. That is the first difference. Secondly, it can be produced from renewable resources or through process linked to ethanol or sugarcane production. And what is the present usage of the isobutanol? It is currently used as industrial solvent in products like paints, coatings, and potential biofuel for transportation, etc. Now, the significance here will be same as compared to the ethanol blending. That is, it blends uniformly without any additional additives. It provides higher energy content. It is less volatile and corrosive, offering higher compatibility with the existing engines and fuel infrastructure. The second news is about Majoli Island. So recently a study has been conducted and it has reconstructed 4,000 years of what it was during Majoli Islands in the climate, and it has used sediments from the Sakali wetland. So essentially it has tried to recapture what Majoli used to be like in before 4,000 years. So before we go into this, we should understand what exactly is the core details about Majoli. So it is world's largest river island and it is located in the state of Assam. It became India's first river island district in 2016. So it is a district. It is bounded by Subansiri and its tributaries on the northwest, and then its key features are region of fluvial geomorphology, formation of islets locally called chaporis, etc. It is hub of Assamese new Vaishnavite culture, and it is known for the tradition of sataras. It is included in the tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2004. Next, Agastya Malai Biosphere Reserve. So Supreme Court recently has ordered the immediate removal of encroachers and demolition of illegal structure across the Agastya Malai landscape comprising the Agastya Malai Biosphere Reserve. Now this comes as again as a move where Supreme Court earlier had taken very strong decision regarding the Chambal Wildlife Sanctuary. So in a way we can see that Supreme Court is consistently giving impetus to the environmental cases, right? So when we talk about Agastya Malai Biosphere Reserve, it is located in the southern Western Ghat at the cross section of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. It is included in the World Network of Biosphere Reserves under UNESCO's Man and Biosphere Program 2016. And importantly, the reserve include 3 wildlife sanctuaries, and it also has well as Kalakad Tiger Reserve as well. Then the next topic is ground level ozone. So when it comes to the summer pollution in Delhi, there are 2 major pollutants that are making a lot of names today. Essentially one is PM10 and the second one is ozone. So a recent study has highlighted that ground level ozone is coming as or emerging as a major air pollution challenge in Delhi. Now let's talk about ground level ozone. So ground level ozone is a secondary air pollutant which is found in the troposphere, the first layer of the atmosphere, formed by reaction between nitrogen oxide, NOx, NOx, and volatile organic compounds in the presence of sunlight. Now, in the summer, you can see that sunlight is more. With more sunlight, the formation or this reaction gets supported, and therefore formation of ozone is enhanced, right? So what is the major sources of this? Vehicles, industries, and thermal power plants. It peaks during summer due to intense solar radiation. What is the impact of ground level ozone? It leads to respiratory ailments, crop damage, and photochemical smog. But at the same time, you should distinguish between good ozone and bad ozone. So the ozone which is present at the stratosphere is not bad. In fact, it shields Earth from UV rays. Ground level ozone is a harmful pollutant, that is bad ozone. What is the safe limit? 100 microgram per meter cube for 8 hourly monitored value and 180 microgram per meter cube for 1 hour monitored value, both under WHO standards as well as National Ambient Air Quality Standards 2009. Then India-Myanmar relations. So recently the President of Myanmar was there in India and Prime Minister of India have received him, and we have talked about the bilateral, regional and global issues of mutual interest. Along with that, we have also talked about AI and space. Both nations have welcomed the steady growth of the Rupee Kyat settlement mechanism that is operationalized in 2024 to facilitate easier bilateral trade. In fact, this is a trend that you will see that India is trying to go for this kind of trade settlement in the domestic currencies, because this will not only reduce the demand or consumption of dollar, but it will also develop stake in each other's economy. Now, when it comes to the significance of Indo-Myanmar relation, you should understand that Myanmar currently is undergoing an ethnic clash, right? So it is large part of Myanmar is occupied by the rebel groups. So in that respect, it is very important that we have good relations with whoever party or whoever government is there in Myanmar. So in a way, because of the significance of the Myanmar, we need to be very cautious. So first, geostrategically, Myanmar lies at the confluence of India's neighborhood first policy, Act East policy, and the Mahasagar policies. In fact, it also has important connectivity, part of connectivity projects such as India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway, and the Kaladan multimodal project. And the purpose is to boost regional economic integration. And when it comes to security also, Myanmar is important because it is to manage the ethnic cross-border insurgencies along the 1,643 kilometer long border to check arms, weapons, narcotics, smuggling essentially through the Golden Triangle route. Then we also have cultural soft power where deep-rooted historical ties built around shared Theravada Buddhist heritage exist. So because of these reasons, Myanmar continues to be very important for India. Next very important development, Supreme Court has established that right to be forgotten is part of right to privacy under Article 21 of the Constitution, and this development came under this Lakshveer Singh Yadav versus Union of India case. What exactly is right to be forgotten? It means that right to seek removal or restricted access to personal information from public accessibility that no longer serves legitimate purpose. So if you want your name to be diluted or deleted from certain public forum, then right to be forgotten can be utilized, right? So this is about right to be forgotten, but what if you have been committed certain crime which have been proved, or something that is required for public purpose? So again, this is a nuanced judgment. It is not an absolute judgment. It provides for certain nuances. So let's take a look into this. So first, it sets out the detailed principles on when name can be de-indexed or when it can be masked. So these two terms are very important when it comes to right to be forgotten: de-indexing and de-masking or masking. So de-indexing essentially removes a person's name as a searchable key. So if you use some person's name as in Google search, then it will remove its name without deleting the record. So the record will not delete, but his name will be removed from the searchable index, limiting access through name-based cases. Application will be there in cases ending in acquittal or discharge, and exceptions that it can't be applied in cases against women, children, or breach of public trust. So essentially here public trust doctrine has been utilized by the Supreme Court. And masking, what exactly is masking? Masking means replacing names and personal details in judicial records with neutral labels such as XYZ, such as John Doe, etc. Right? All these things. Then the next news is about India-Oman CEPA has come into effect from today. And let's talk about this detail. So when it comes to Oman side, 99.38% of India's exports by value will receive immediate zero duty access to Oman, and 100% FDI for Indian companies in major service sector in Oman. From India's side, India has trade tariff liberalization on 77.79% of tariff lines, covering 94.8% of imports from Oman, while protecting sensitive sectors like dairy, oilseeds, and cereal. So this is the consistent stand that we have taken across the major trade deals that we have signed, whether it is with New Zealand, whether it is with UAE, whether it is with European Union, or the trade negotiation that we are currently going on with US. So in a way, what we have secured is that we are looking into we are protecting our sensitive sector, and yet we are trying to maximize liberalization, the access as much as possible. When it comes to India-Oman trade relation, Oman is India's second largest trading partner in Gulf with 11 billion bilateral trade, and Oman's logistics hubs at Sohar, Duqm, and Salalah provide access to India to wider Gulf Cooperation Council and East African market. In fact, Indian Navy has a base in Duqm port as well. Okay. The last news for today is about climate change impact on the India's coastal region. Here we just need to understand some of the important impact and some data, because again, we would know some of the major concepts, but we need certain data to back our analysis. So this research was done by Azim Premji University, and it has warned about severe hyper-local climate shifts across India's 11,000 kilometer coastline. So if you're not aware, please note that the coastline of India has been updated, right? So earlier it used to be around 6,000, but now because of the recent satellite data and other details, we have now updated the coastline length. Okay. Now what exactly are the key highlights of the report? First is that a 5 centimeter sea level rise by 2050 will rapidly accelerate shoreline loss, which will lead to coastal erosion. Then rapid ocean warming is fueling more intense tropical cyclones. So this is again one of the hazards that the coastal states follow, and that hazard essentially is going to be localized in nature. Then temperature anomalies, in fact, around 40 districts will see summer peaks spike by 1 degree Celsius and more, approaching unsafe humidity level thresholds. Then while average precipitation will increase, the growth is concentrated on the western coast. And cyclone-driven storm surges are forcing seawater into fresh groundwater. So in a way, this will also reduce the drinking potential or the drinking water supply. So this was some of the concerns that we can also highlight in the recent study that we were talking about earlier, right? So these are the key highlights of the report. So this is all about news today for today. I hope this was useful. Thank you and all the best.